This lecture is intended to give you a brief and broad overview of modern sculpture, particularly modern American sculpture. Now, before we get into the work of David Smith, we're going to look at a couple of his pieces in this lecture. We'll talk a minute about constructed sculpture. Sculptors began to use the technique of welding, and this led to the emergence of constructed sculpture. As the name suggests, this is sculpture that is constructed, rather than being created through a subtractive process like carving, rather than being created through an additive process like modeling, where you're building up the form with a pliable material such as clay, and rather than assembling, bringing together found objects, assemblage. With constructed sculpture, you're literally building or constructing. And this is a technique most often that is using some sort of metal. Now, we should note that this was not a technique or a form of sculpture that was initially accepted by the art world. It was associated as the stuff of industry and blue-collar work, not fine art. And many early constructed works were equated with plumbing. Now, of course, now, very popular form of sculpture, accepted in fine art. It's not a coincidence that we see constructed sculpture emerge at this moment in art history. The technique of welding allowed for an immediacy that casting did not. It also allowed for expression and gesture to be inscribed into the form. The sculptor could move quickly, improvisationally, and create these more fluid, organic forms. Now, Smith's work was emblematic of his search for truth, for a way to access the more primal aspects of his inner being. And there is an existentialist component to Smith's work, where he's kind of questioning the meaning of life in ways that can be a little bit nihilist or negative. And that's very much a remnant of the post-World War II period, a wider cultural feeling that many experienced in both Europe as well as America. In Smith's early work, such as what we see here, there clearly is a connection between this type of sculpture and the sculpture found often in Surrealism. So Surrealism was a style that tried to harness the unconscious and reflected unconscious ideas, and often did so in sculpture through these very odd, irregular, biomorphic forms that were not immediately recognizable as an object from our objective reality, bringing out imagination, which in turn says something to one's internal thought processes. So you have here that similar approach, biomorphic shapes that are essentially non-representational. With the title of the work, we have a reference to totem imagery. This is a reference to myth, to spirituality, to mysticism, content that Smith believed was universal, was applicable to all of humanity. The sculpture that we see here, which is part of a series that has similar form and similar intent in its message. Let's look at another example. This one's very different. This one here, organic, expressive. Here it's much more geometric, a little bit more rigid. This is indicating a progression in Smith's work. His approach to expression changed as his work progressed. He began to express more specifically his own conceptions of masculinity, articulating this in terms of an aggression or a certain assertion. So definitely not a shy or timid masculinity. The sharply delineated forms that we see here, they actively occupy and command the negative space that surrounds the sculpture. This sculpture is larger than his earlier work, and with the verticality of the work, the vertical rise, there's some kind of notion of being virile. I always like to, or tend to, go to this place of suggesting phallic symbols, which I think is totally appropriate if the work is intended to be about masculinity. This work, too, is part of a series, tends to be a common approach with Smith's art. This is his most celebrated series, the Cubi series. 28 total works in this series. These 28 works, of geometric sculptures, so made from geometric shapes, stainless steel as a material. Some of the works were polished, like this one, and then others were painted to prevent rusting. His Cubi sculptures interact dynamically with the space, but also with the light, which you can see in this photograph. With the metal, it has a reflective quality. It also, with the variation of forms in their position, some of the forms seem to be lit up, while others are relegated to the shadows. This heightens the sense of volume. It calls attention to the surface, a surface that is treated in a manner that is reminiscent to brushstrokes. And that's where the expression, the gesture, comes in. Gesture is the capturing of the artist's movement as he makes the piece. It's considered to be highly expressive to see the physical movements. So it's interesting. There's a lack of expression through the use of geometric forms, which tend to be alienating, not really bringing out imagination like the previous piece, but yet there is expression in the gesture on the surface. So notes in his sketchbook indicate that these geometric forms were actually intended to be reductivist explorations of human form. So our bodies reduced down to these shapes. Here's another example of constructed sculpture. This one's also made out of welded steel. John Chamberlain's work has sometimes been labeled junk sculpture in that he welded discarded metal to make his sculptures. For him, it was intended to be a reference to the urban experience, perhaps the urban landscape, an urban landscape full of cars and things like that. And it also is meant to be a reference to the visual as well as the psychological debris that populates these landscapes. Most of Chamberlain's sculptures were made from crushed car parts to create a dynamic interaction between form and space. He also refused to finish the sculptures. They're sharp, they're jagged, and there's damaged areas where you can see that paint remains. The thing that's interesting about Chamberlain's work is it suggests this level of spontaneity, that there's something improvisational about his work. And with sculpture, that's kind of a hard thing to suggest because the process is so detailed and careful when one is working to reveal form from material. A lot of people say that John Chamberlain's sculptures should be stylistically categorized as abstract expressionist, which is another style that looks to gesture, to expression, to implied movement within form. And I think that that is an accurate suggestion. Now, Chamberlain's use of automobile scraps was a tactic that was becoming increasingly typical in modern sculpture. Materials that are being used to challenge the distinction between high art and everyday objects in everyday life, where many people might question, could thrown away discarded scraps of automobiles be considered fine art? And John Chamberlain is making sculptures that suggest that indeed you can. And in many ways, this is kind of a glimpse of things to come, what we see, because later on we're going to see the American, well, it's English, but it's better articulated in America, the style of pop art that also is looking to the everyday. And we'll finish up by looking at a piece by Louise Nevelson. Nevelson's work is also sometimes referred to as junk sculpture because she too used found objects in her work. Found objects are objects that the artist has not created. Simply the objects have been found and have been incorporated into the sculpture. Just a little aside, this sculpture, not this sculpture, but this artist and this artist both feature work in the modern collection at the Phoenix Art Museum. So that would be something interesting to go and see. Now, with Nevelson, she mostly worked with wood, and she would paint these pieces to create a monochromatic sculpture, all one color. Usually her works are black, like the one at the Phoenix Art Museum, white, like we see here, or gold, which has the effect of unifying all of the diverse components of the piece. Now, a good label for Nevelson's work would probably be assemblage, because she's assembling found objects. This is not construction, because she's not using a technique like welding. There's no building like what we've seen in the previous works. With the appearance of this piece and its title, we can see that she's clearly attempting to give this work an architectural quality, to make it look like a building, which seems to be a common approach for a lot of her work. This is achieved by taking her found objects, arranging them, and constraining them within boxes of varying sizes. She joins them together to form the walls of her structural sculptures. This piece was actually originally part of a larger installation called Dawn's Wedding's Feast. The large piece has been taken apart after its original exhibition and is now shown in individual components, individual works like this that are existing now as separate works of art. Altogether, this is meant to be referring to varying aspects of marriage, an institution that Nevelson actually professed much aversion to, although art historians are unsure how this aversion factors into the meaning of this piece, and it's not something that she really has come out and clearly discussed. Clearly, this portion of the larger work refers to the space where marriage occurs, the church, and the objects that are inside it have been interpreted as referencing a trousseau or a dowry, the objects that the bride or the new wife will take into the marriage as a way to set up the domestic space that traditionally she would preside over.